My name is Daniel Russo, and I learned something most men never figure out until it's too late. Love doesn't always come from the person sleeping next to you. Sometimes it comes from the woman who raised you, the one who taught you how to tie your shoes and stand up straight when the world wanted you bent. My wife gave me an ultimatum, her or my mother, and I made a choice that cost me everything I thought mattered. But here's the thing about losing everything. Sometimes you find out what you actually had all along, and sometimes you discover that the people you trusted most were just waiting for the right moment to take it all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This isn't a story about being right or being wrong. It's about what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness, when they confuse patience with stupidity, and when they forget that the man they married came from somewhere, from someone who made him who he is. So if you think you know how this ends, you don't. Because what happened next didn't just change my life. It exposed a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for years. The morning it all started, I was standing in my mother's kitchen watching her struggle with a mason jar. Her hands, the same ones that used to open anything without hesitation, shook as she twisted the lid. She didn't ask for help. She never did. But I saw the tremor, saw the way her knuckles had gone pale from gripping too hard, and I stepped forward without saying a word. She looked up at me with those deep brown eyes that had seen me through skinned knees and broken hearts, and she smiled that small smile that said thank you without making it a thing. My mother, Elena Russo, was 73 years old and still lived in the same two-bedroom house in Cranston where she'd raised me and my younger sister. The wallpaper was the same floral pattern from the 80s. The kitchen table was still that heavy oak thing my father had built before the cancer took him when I was 12. Everything about that house was a time capsule, but it wasn't stuck in the past. It was honored history, preserved love, the foundation of everything I'd become. I twisted the lid off the jar and set it down gently. She was making her famous marinara sauce, the kind that took all day and filled the entire house with the smell of basil and garlic and something that can't be bottled or bought. She'd been making it every Sunday for as long as I could remember, and even after I got married and moved across town, I still came back for it. Not just for the food, but for the ritual, for the unspoken language of a son and his mother existing in the same space without needing to fill it with noise. My phone buzzed on the counter. A text from my wife, Victoria. "Where are you?" We had plans. I stared at the screen. We didn't have plans. At least, none that she'd mentioned. I texted back, "With Mom, making Sunday sauce, be home in a few hours." The response came fast. "Of course you are. Always with her." I felt the tension creep into my shoulders, that familiar tightness that had been showing up more and more over the past 2 years. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and focused on stirring the pot my mother handed me. She didn't ask what the text said. She didn't need to. Mothers have a way of knowing when something's wrong without needing the details. We worked in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable quiet that only comes from years of understanding. She chopped tomatoes. I stirred. The radio played old Italian songs my grandmother used to hum. Outside, the October wind rattled the screen door, and the leaves scattered across the lawn like pieces of torn paper. It was peaceful. Simple. Everything my life at home wasn't. Victoria and I had been married for 9 years. We had 2 kids, Emma who was 7 and Lucas who was 5. On paper, we looked perfect. Nice house in the suburbs, good jobs, family vacations to places with beaches and all-inclusive resorts. But paper doesn't show the cracks. It doesn't show the way she'd started talking to me like I was an employee instead of a partner, or the way every decision I made was somehow wrong unless it was exactly what she wanted. It didn't show the way my mother had slowly been erased from our family photos, uninvited from holidays, or made to feel like an inconvenience whenever she asked to see her grandchildren. At first, I thought it was just normal tension between a wife and a mother-in-law. Every marriage has it. But over time, it became something sharper, something deliberate. Victoria would schedule trips on the weekends I'd promised to help my mother with yard work. She'd plan elaborate birthday parties for the kids and casually mention that my mother's house was too small to host everyone. She'd sigh dramatically whenever I mentioned stopping by to check on her, and she'd make comments about how I was a grown man who needed to stop running to mommy every time something needed fixing. The thing was, my mother never asked me to run anywhere. She never demanded my time or guilt-tripped me into showing up. I went because I wanted to. Because she was alone in that house, because my sister had moved to Seattle and barely called, and because the woman who gave me everything deserved more than to be forgotten in her final years. I stirred the sauce and watched the bubbles rise and pop, little eruptions of heat that reminded me of everything simmering beneath the surface of my marriage. My mother glanced over at me, her reading glasses perched on her nose, and she touched my arm gently. "You okay, Danny?" I nodded. "Yeah, Ma. I'm good." She didn't believe me, but she didn't push. That was her way. She gave me space to feel what I needed to feel, and when I was ready, she'd be there. No judgment. No lectures. Just presence. I left her house a few hours later with 2 containers of sauce, one for me and one she insisted I take to Mrs. Callahan next door who'd just had surgery. I loaded them into my car and sat in the driveway for a moment, staring at the house through the windshield. The porch light was on even though it was barely 4 in the afternoon. My mother always turned it on early, said it made the house feel welcoming. I wondered if she kept it on for herself or for the memory of my father, who used to sit on that porch every evening with a cigar and a crossword puzzle. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through the old neighborhoods where the trees formed tunnels over the street and the houses still had those wide front porches where people actually sat. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sun had started to dip, and the sky had gone that deep orange that only happens in autumn. Victoria's car was in the garage. The lights were on inside. I grabbed the container of sauce and walked through the side door into the kitchen. The house was warm, almost too warm, and I could hear the television in the living room playing some reality show Victoria liked. I set the container on the counter and called out, "I'm home." No response. I walked toward the living room and found her sitting on the couch, arms crossed, staring at the TV but not really watching it. Emma and Lucas were nowhere in sight, probably upstairs in their rooms. "Hey," I said, stepping into the room. "Sorry I'm late. Mom wanted to send some sauce home." Victoria didn't look at me. She just exhaled slowly through her nose, the kind of breath that means she's been waiting to have a conversation she doesn't want to have. "We need to talk," she said. I sat down in the chair across from her, already bracing myself. "Okay. Talk." She finally turned to look at me, and her face was hard, set in that expression she wore when she'd already made up her mind about something and was just waiting for me to catch up. "I'm tired, Daniel. I'm tired of feeling like I'm competing with your mother for your attention." I blinked. "You're not competing with anyone." "Really?" "Because it sure feels like it. Every Sunday, you're over there. Every time she calls, you drop everything. You spend more time in that house than you do in this one." "That's not true." "Isn't it?" She leaned forward, her voice rising just enough to make it clear this wasn't a casual observation. "When was the last time we did something as a family on a Sunday? When was the last time you took the kids somewhere without checking your phone every 5 minutes to see if she needs something?" I opened my mouth to respond, but she cut me off. "I've tried to be understanding, Daniel. I really have. But I can't do this anymore. I can't keep pretending that it's normal for a grown man to prioritize his mother over his wife and children." The words hit like a slap. I'm not prioritizing anyone. I'm just making sure she's okay. She's alone, Vicky. She's 73 years old and she's alone. And whose fault is that? Victoria snapped. She made her choices. She could have moved closer to your sister. She could have sold that house and gotten a place near us. But no, she wants to stay in that outdated little shrine to your father and expect you to keep running back like some kind of errand boy. Don't talk about her like that. Why not? It's the truth. She leaned back, crossing her arms again. And you know what the truth is, Daniel? You're never going to be fully present in this marriage as long as she's pulling you back there. I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. Are you seriously asking me to choose between you and my mother? I'm telling you that something has to change. She paused, letting the silence stretch. Because I can't keep living like this. The kids can't keep living like this. The kids are fine. Are they? Because Emma asked me last week why Grandma Elena doesn't come to her recitals anymore. And you know what I told her? I told her Grandma's busy. But the truth is, Daniel, I don't invite her because I'm tired of watching you cater to her needs while mine get ignored. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists not from anger but from the sheer frustration of being cornered into a conversation that had no good outcome. So what do you want me to do? Cut her out of my life? Pretend she doesn't exist? I want you to set boundaries. I want you to put your family first. She stood up too, stepping closer. I want you to choose us. I'm not choosing anyone. This isn't a competition. Then why does it feel like I'm losing? We stood there in the middle of the living room, the space between us feeling wider than it ever had. The television droned on in the background, some argument between strangers that felt strangely fitting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I looked at my wife, the woman I'd promised to build a life with, and I realized I didn't recognize the person standing in front of me. Or maybe I'd just been ignoring the signs for too long. I need some air, I said quietly, turning toward the door. Daniel. I didn't stop. I walked out into the garage, got into my car, and sat there in the dark with my hands on the steering wheel. My phone buzzed. A text from my mother. Thank you for today. I love you. I stared at those words until they blurred, and then I started the car and drove. I didn't have a destination in mind, just the need to move, to think, to breathe without feeling like the walls were closing in. I ended up at a park near the river, the same park where my father used to take me fishing when I was a kid. It was nearly empty now, just a couple walking their dog in the distance and a jogger passing under the streetlights. I sat on a bench overlooking the water and watched the current move, steady and unbothered by anything happening on the shore. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Victoria. Where did you go? I didn't answer. I just sat there, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had it come to this? How had the woman I married, the woman who used to smile when my mother brought over homemade cookies for the kids, turned into someone who saw my mother as a threat? The answer, I realized, had been building for years. Little comments here and there. Small exclusions that didn't seem like a big deal at the time. The way Victoria would schedule family events without consulting me, then act surprised when I mentioned my mother might want to be included. The way she'd roll her eyes when I said I was stopping by to help with groceries or fix a leaky faucet. It wasn't one big moment. It was 1,000 tiny cuts that I'd ignored because I thought they'd heal on their own. But they hadn't healed. They'd festered. And now I was sitting on a bench in the dark, trying to figure out how to fix something that maybe couldn't be fixed. I thought about my father. He'd been a quiet man, the kind who measured his words carefully and never raised his voice. But he'd been firm when it mattered. He used to tell me that a man's job wasn't to make everyone happy, it was to do what was right even when it was hard. I didn't fully understand what he meant until now. Choosing my mother wasn't about picking sides. It was about honoring the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give me a chance at a better life. It was about recognizing that love isn't a finite resource that runs out if you share it. And it was about refusing to let someone erase the person who made me who I am. I pulled out my phone and texted Victoria back. I'm fine. I'll be home soon. We'll talk. Her response came immediately. We need to figure this out, Daniel. I mean it. I know, I typed. So do I. I sat there a while longer, listening to the water and the wind and the distant hum of traffic. When I finally drove home, the house was dark except for the porch light. I walked inside quietly, checked on the kids who were both asleep, and then went to the bedroom. Victoria was sitting up in bed, her laptop open, scrolling through something I couldn't see. She looked up when I walked in. "We need to finish this conversation." I nodded, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I know. But I need you to hear me, really hear me, because I don't think you understand what you're asking." She closed the laptop. "I'm asking you to prioritize your family. My mother is my family. She's not your responsibility anymore, Daniel. You have a wife. You have kids. They should come first. They do come first. But that doesn't mean I abandon the woman who gave up everything so I could have a life. She worked 2 jobs to put me through college. She sat with me every night when Dad died and I couldn't sleep. She's not some obligation I need to check off a list. She's my mother." Victoria's jaw tightened. "So what are you saying? That I'm supposed to just accept that she'll always be more important than me?" "I'm saying you shouldn't have to compete. I'm saying there's room for both of you in my life, and if you can't see that, then the problem isn't my mother. It's how you see her." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that presses down on your chest and makes it hard to breathe. Victoria stared at me, and I could see something shifting in her expression, something cold and calculating. "Fine," she said finally. "If that's how you feel, then I guess we know where we stand." "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done pretending this is going to work." She swung her legs out of bed and stood up. "I've given you chance after chance to choose us, and every time, you go running back to her. So you know what, Daniel? Keep her. But don't expect me to stick around and watch." I stood up too, my heart pounding. "You're serious right now? You're actually going to blow up our marriage because I won't cut my mother out of my life?" "I'm not blowing it up. You already did." She grabbed her phone off the nightstand. "I'll be staying at my sister's for a few days. You can think about what you really want, and when you're ready to put your family first, let me know." She walked past me without looking back, grabbed a bag from the closet, and started throwing clothes into it. I stood there, frozen, watching my marriage disintegrate in real time over something that should never have been an issue in the first place. "What about the kids?" I asked quietly. "They'll come with me." She zipped the bag shut. "You can see them on weekends. Maybe spending some time alone will help you figure out what matters." She walked out of the bedroom, down the stairs, and out the front door. I heard her car start, heard the engine fade into the distance, and then the house was silent. I sat back down on the bed, staring at the wall, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed. A text from Victoria's sister, Lauren. "Just so you know, Vicky's been talking to a lawyer. Thought you should be prepared." I read the message 3 times, each word sinking in deeper than the last. A lawyer. She'd already been planning this. The ultimatum wasn't a plea for change. It was a trap, a way to justify what she'd already decided to do. I called my mother. It was late, almost 11, but she answered on the second ring. "Danny? What's wrong?" I didn't know how to explain it, didn't know how to put into words the fact that my entire life had just fallen apart because I refused to betray the woman who raised me. So I just said the only thing I could. "I think I need to come over, Ma. I'll put the coffee on." I drove back to Cranston in the dark, the roads empty and quiet. When I pulled into her driveway, the porch light was on, and she was standing in the doorway in her robe, waiting. I walked up the steps, and she pulled me into a hug without asking questions. We stood there for a long moment, and then she led me inside, sat me down at the kitchen table, and poured 2 cups of coffee. "Tell me," she said simply. And I did. I told her everything. The ultimatum, the fight, Victoria leaving with the kids, the text from Lauren about the lawyer. My mother listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around her mug, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table and took my hand. "You did the right thing, Danny. I don't feel like I did. I know. But you did." She squeezed my hand. A woman who makes you choose between her and your family isn't a woman who loves you the way you deserve to be loved. And I won't let you sacrifice yourself to keep someone happy who doesn't value what you give. I felt the tears coming, the kind I'd been holding back since Victoria walked out the door. What am I supposed to do now? You keep going. You take care of your kids. And you remember that real love doesn't come with conditions. I stayed at my mother's house that night, sleeping in my old bedroom with the same creaky bed and the same posters on the walls from when I was 16. It felt surreal, like I'd somehow stepped backward in time. But when I woke up the next morning to the smell of coffee and eggs, I realized something. I hadn't lost everything. I'd just finally seen what was real and what was pretend. Victoria filed for divorce 3 weeks later. The papers came in the mail on a Tuesday, delivered by a process server who apologized as he handed them over. I sat in my mother's kitchen and read through the demands. Full custody of the children. The house. Half of everything I owned. And a request for spousal support that made my lawyer laugh out loud when I showed it to him. Your wife's ambitious, he said, leaning back in his chair. But ambition doesn't always equal reality. His name was Richard Castellano, a friend of my father's from way back who'd built a reputation as one of the best family law attorneys in the state. He was in his 60s, silver-haired, with the kind of calm demeanor that made you feel like everything was going to be okay even when it wasn't. What are my options? I asked. He tapped the papers with his pen. First, we respond. We contest the custody demand, obviously. You're a good father, you've got a stable home, and there's no reason she should get full custody unless she can prove you're unfit, which she can't. Second, we address the financials. He looked up at me. She knows about the trust, right? I nodded. My father had been a smart man, smarter than anyone gave him credit for. Before he died, he'd set up a trust fund for me, money he'd saved and invested over years of working construction and doing side jobs. It wasn't millions when he passed, but he'd tied it up in investments that grew steadily over time. By the time I was 30, it had ballooned into something significant. $12 million, to be exact. The thing was, the trust was ironclad. My father had structured it so that it couldn't be touched in a divorce, couldn't be claimed by anyone except me and, eventually, my children. He'd seen too many men lose everything to bitter splits, and he'd made sure I wouldn't be one of them. She knows it exists, I said. But she doesn't know the details. Good. Richard smiled, the kind of smile that said he'd been in this game long enough to know how it played out. Let's keep it that way. Over the next few weeks, the legal battle heated up. Victoria's lawyer, a sharp woman named Monica Hartfield, came out swinging. She painted me as a man who neglected his family, who prioritized his mother over his wife and children, who was emotionally unavailable and unfit to share custody. She brought up every Sunday I'd spent at my mother's house, every phone call I'd taken, every time I'd left early to help with something. Richard tore it apart piece by piece. He brought in character witnesses. Neighbors who'd seen me coaching Lucas's soccer team. Teachers who'd watched me attend every single one of Emma's school events. Friends who testified that I was present, engaged, and devoted. He pulled phone records showing that I'd called and texted the kids every single day since Victoria left. He even brought in my mother, who sat on the stand with quiet dignity and explained that I'd never once neglected my family to care for her. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Teresa Vaughn, listened to everything with a careful, measured expression. When it came time for the financial disclosure, that's when things got interesting. Victoria's lawyer requested full transparency on all assets. Richard complied with everything except the trust. He filed a motion to exclude it from the marital estate, citing the terms my father had set up. Monica fought hard, arguing that anything acquired during the marriage should be fair game. Judge Vaughn read through the trust documents, all 140 pages of them, and then looked up at Monica with something close to pity. This trust was established long before the marriage, funded entirely by the deceased father, and contains explicit language excluding it from any marital claims. The motion to exclude is granted. I watched Victoria's face from across the courtroom. The color drained from her cheeks. She leaned over to whisper something to Monica, who just shook her head. That was the moment I realized what this had really been about. It wasn't about the kids. It wasn't about feeling neglected. It was about money. Specifically, about the $12 million she thought she'd get her hands on if she could force me to choose between her and my mother, and then paint me as the villain when I didn't. The custody hearing took another 2 months. Emma and Lucas were interviewed by a child psychologist, who reported back that both children expressed a strong desire to spend time with both parents. The psychologist noted that Emma, in particular, had mentioned missing her grandmother and not understanding why she wasn't allowed to visit anymore. Judge Vaughn awarded joint custody, 50-50, with me keeping the family home since I could prove I'd been the one making the mortgage payments from my salary while Victoria had been funneling money into personal accounts I didn't even know existed. The final divorce decree came down on a gray morning in March. Richard called me with the news while I was sitting at my mother's kitchen table, the same place I'd been sitting when this whole thing started. "You won," he said simply. "Joint custody. You keep the house. She gets a small settlement from the marital assets, but the trust stays untouched." He paused. "She's not happy. I don't imagine she is. There's one more thing." Richard's voice shifted slightly. "We found something during discovery. Turns out your wife had been planning this for over a year. She'd been moving money, consulting with lawyers, even setting up a separate bank account. This wasn't a spontaneous decision, Daniel. This was calculated." I wasn't surprised. I'd suspected as much. The ultimatum had been too clean, too rehearsed. She'd known exactly what she was doing. "Thanks, Richard. For everything. You did good, kid. Your old man would be proud." I hung up and stared at my phone for a long moment. My mother walked into the kitchen, saw my face, and didn't need to ask. "It's over," I said. She nodded, pouring herself a cup of tea. "And now?" "Now I figure out what comes next." What came next was slower and quieter than I expected. Emma and Lucas adjusted to the new routine, spending 1 week with me and 1 week with Victoria. At first, it was rocky. Emma cried the first few nights, asking why Mommy and Daddy couldn't just be in the same house. Lucas clung to me at drop-offs, his little hands gripping my shirt like he thought I might disappear. But kids are resilient in ways adults forget how to be. Over time, they adapted. They started keeping favorite toys at both houses. They stopped asking when we were getting back together. And slowly, carefully, I started bringing them back to my mother's house on Sundays. The first time Emma walked through that door and saw her grandmother standing in the kitchen, she ran straight into her arms and didn't let go for a full 5 minutes. My mother cried, the kind of quiet tears that come from relief and joy mixed together. Lucas was more hesitant, but by the end of the afternoon, he was sitting on her lap while she read him stories in Italian, the same ones she used to read to me. Victoria tried to fight it at first, claiming I was violating the custody agreement by exposing the kids to someone she deemed a negative influence. Richard shut it down in one email, reminding her that the agreement explicitly allowed me to determine who the children spent time with during my custody periods, and unless she could prove my mother was a danger, which she couldn't, she had no legal ground to stand on. After that, Victoria stopped trying. Or maybe she just realized she'd lost more than she'd bargained for. The months passed. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall. I sold the house eventually, the one Victoria had wanted so badly. It was too big, too full of memories that didn't belong to me anymore. I bought a smaller place closer to my mother, a modest 3-bedroom with a yard big enough for the kids to play in and a porch where I could sit in the evenings and watch the sun go down. My mother's health started to decline around the holidays. Nothing dramatic, just the slow, inevitable where that comes with age. Her hands shook more. She moved slower. I started coming by every day, not because she asked, but because I wanted to. Emma and Lucas came too, helping her bake cookies, learning how to make sauce the way she'd taught me. One evening, as I was washing dishes while she dried, she looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "You know, Danny, I used to worry I'd become a burden to you. That you'd resent me for needing help." I stopped washing and turned to face her. "You could never be a burden, Ma. Never." She smiled, that same small smile from all those years ago. "I know that now. And I'm grateful. Not just because you help, but because you chose to. Even when it cost you. It didn't cost me anything I wasn't willing to lose." She reached up and touched my cheek, her hand warm and steady despite the tremor. "That's how I know I raised you right." We finished the dishes in silence, and when I left that night, I drove home with a peace I hadn't felt in years. The road ahead wasn't easy. Co-parenting with Victoria was still complicated, still filled with tension and unspoken resentments. But I had my kids. I had my mother. And I had the knowledge that I'd made the right choice, even when it was the hardest one. Some men spend their whole lives trying to please everyone, bending and twisting until they don't recognize themselves anymore. I'd almost become one of them. But in the end, I chose differently. I chose the woman who taught me what love actually looks like, the kind that doesn't demand or manipulate or threaten. The kind that just shows up, day after day, no conditions attached. And that choice, that single decision to honor the person who made me who I am, didn't just save my relationship with my mother. It saved me. Victoria didn't take the divorce well, but she hid it better than most people would have expected. On the surface, she moved on quickly. Too quickly. Within 3 months of the decree being finalized, she was dating someone new, a real estate developer named Brett Kingsley who drove a Tesla and wore sunglasses that cost more than most people's monthly rent. She made sure I knew about it too, posting photos on social media of them at wine tastings and beach resorts, her smile wide and performative, like she was trying to prove something to an audience that wasn't paying attention. The kids mentioned him in passing. Emma said he was nice but talked too much about himself. Lucas said he smelled like the cologne counter at the department store, the kind that makes your eyes water. I didn't press for details. It wasn't my business who Victoria spent her time with, as long as the kids were safe and cared for. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't notice the pattern. Every man she introduced them to seemed to have money, seemed to fit a certain image she was cultivating. It wasn't about connection. It was about presentation. Meanwhile, I focused on what mattered. Emma had started taking piano lessons, something she'd wanted to do for years but Victoria had always dismissed as too expensive or too much of a time commitment. Now she practiced every evening at my house, her small fingers stumbling over the keys, her face scrunched in concentration. Lucas had joined a little league team, and I coached alongside 2 other dads who'd become friends over the course of the season. We'd grab coffee after practice, talk about work and kids and the impossibility of assembling anything from a furniture store without losing your mind. My mother's health continued its slow decline. She'd been diagnosed with early-stage heart failure in August, nothing immediately life-threatening, but enough to require medication and regular checkups. I took her to every appointment, sat in those sterile waiting rooms with outdated magazines and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look half dead. The doctors were kind but clinical, explaining treatment plans and lifestyle changes in the detached way medical professionals do when they've delivered the same speech 1,000 times. She took it all in stride. Never complained, never asked why this was happening to her. She just adjusted, started taking her pills every morning with breakfast, cut back on salt, moved a little slower. I tried to hide my worry, but she saw through it the way mothers always do. One afternoon in late September, I was helping her organize the garage, a project she'd been putting off for years. We were sorting through boxes of old photographs and holiday decorations when I found a manila envelope tucked between 2 albums. It had my name written on it in my father's handwriting, the letters slightly shaky but unmistakable. "What's this?" I asked, holding it up. My mother glanced over, and something flickered across her face. Recognition, maybe hesitation. "Oh, I forgot that was still in there. Your father left that for you. Said to give it to you when the time was right." "When's the right time?" She smiled sadly. I think now's as good as any. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside were several documents, legal papers mostly, along with a handwritten letter. I unfolded the letter first, recognizing my father's careful script, the way he always wrote in print because his cursive was illegible. The letter was dated 2 months before he died. Danny, it began. If you're reading this, I'm already gone, and I hope your mother waited until you were old enough to understand what I'm about to tell you. I've spent a lot of time thinking about what kind of legacy I want to leave you, and I realized it's not just about money or property. It's about protection. I've seen too many good men get destroyed by people who saw them as resources instead of human beings. I don't know who you'll marry or what your life will look like, but I want to make sure that if things go wrong, you'll have something that can't be taken from you. I set up the trust to protect you. Not because I think you're weak, but because I know you're kind, and kind people get taken advantage of. The money in that trust isn't just for you. It's for your future, for your children, for the life you'll build. But it's structured in a way that keeps it safe from anyone who might try to claim it out of greed or spite. There's more to it than you know. I've included instructions in this envelope. Follow them carefully. Trust the people I've named. And remember, son, wealth isn't about having more than other people. It's about having enough to live with dignity and help the people who matter. I love you. Take care of your mother. She's tougher than she looks, but she'll need you when I'm gone. Dad. I read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing something I'd missed before. Then I looked at the documents. Most of it was legal jargon I didn't fully understand, but there was a name listed as the trust administrator, someone I'd never heard of. Gerald Feinstein, attorney at law, with an address in Providence. I looked up at my mother. Did you know about this? Some of it. Your father didn't tell me everything. He said it was better if I didn't know all the details, in case anyone ever tried to pressure me for information. Who would pressure you? She just looked at me, and I understood. Victoria. Or someone like her. I called Gerald Feinstein the next day. His office was in a building downtown, one of those old brownstones that had been converted into professional spaces. The receptionist led me to a corner office lined with bookshelves and dark wood furniture. Feinstein himself was in his 70s, thin and sharp-eyed, with the kind of presence that made you sit up straighter without realizing it. He stood when I entered and shook my hand firmly. Daniel Russo. I've been waiting for this call. You have? Your father told me you'd reach out eventually. He was very specific about the timing. Said you'd know when you needed to. We sat, and he pulled out a file that looked like it had been waiting in his cabinet for years. He opened it and slid a document across the desk. This is the full trust agreement. I'm sure you've seen parts of it during your divorce proceedings, but there are elements your ex-wife's legal team never got access to. I scanned the pages. The trust was more complex than I'd realized. It wasn't just a lump sum sitting in an account. It was invested across multiple vehicles, real estate holdings, stocks, bonds, even a small portfolio of patents my father had somehow acquired over the years. The total value had grown significantly since his death, compounding annually in ways I didn't fully understand. Your father was a careful man, Feinstein said. He didn't just want to leave you money. He wanted to leave you options. This trust is designed to generate income without depleting the principal. If managed correctly, it could support you and your descendants for generations. Why didn't he just tell me this? Because he knew that knowledge can be a burden. If you'd known the full extent of this during your marriage, it might have changed how you behaved, how you were perceived. He wanted you to live your life without that weight until you needed it. I sat back, trying to process everything. And now? Now you have access to everything. The income, the assets, the decision-making authority. Your father put safeguards in place to protect it from divorce proceedings, but those safeguards expire once you have sole custody or once your children reach adulthood. He structured it so that Emma and Lucas will inherit equal shares when they turn 25, assuming you agree to that distribution. I nodded slowly. What do I need to do? Just sign some paperwork acknowledging that you've been fully briefed on the terms. After that, it's yours to manage as you see fit. I'll continue to serve as the administrator unless you'd prefer someone else. No, I trust my father's judgment. If he chose you, that's good enough for me. We spent the next hour going through the details. Feinstein explained the various investments, the expected returns, the tax implications. By the time I left his office, my head was spinning. I'd known the trust existed, but I hadn't understood the scope of it. $12 million wasn't just a number. It was freedom, security, the ability to provide for my kids without ever worrying about money again. But it was also a secret that had nearly cost me everything. I thought about Victoria, about the way she'd pushed and prodded, trying to find out more about the trust during the divorce. Her lawyer had filed motion after motion, demanding transparency, claiming I was hiding assets. They'd never been able to prove anything because my father had been too smart, too careful. But the fact that she'd tried, that she'd fought so hard to get her hands on something that was never hers to begin with, told me everything I needed to know about what our marriage had really been. That evening, I sat with my mother on her porch. The air was cool, the kind of crisp autumn chill that smells like wood smoke and falling leaves. She was wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea cradled in her hands. I met with Feinstein today, I said. She nodded. And I understand now why Dad did it the way he did. He loved you very much. He wanted to make sure you'd be okay, no matter what. I think he knew something I didn't. About people. About how they change when money's involved. She took a sip of her tea. Your father saw a lot in his life. He knew that not everyone who says they love you actually does. Some people love what you can give them, not who you are. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. It was the kind of peaceful moment that feels rare in a world that's always moving too fast. Do you ever regret it? I asked. Staying with Dad even when things were hard? Never. She looked at me, her eyes clear. He wasn't perfect, but he loved me for the right reasons. And that's more than most people get. I thought about Victoria, about the years I'd spent trying to make her happy, bending myself into shapes I didn't recognize. I thought about the ultimatum, the way she'd framed it like I was the one being unreasonable. And I realized that my father had given me more than money. He'd given me a way out, a safety net for the day when everything fell apart. The following week, Emma had a piano recital. It was a small event, held in the community center, with folding chairs and a slightly out-of-tune upright piano. Parents crowded into the room, phones out, ready to record their children's performances. I sat in the third row with Lucas on one side and my mother on the other. Victoria was there too, sitting near the back with Brett. She didn't acknowledge us. When Emma's turn came, she walked up to the piano with her hands clasped in front of her, looking so small and serious. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her fingers on the keys. For a moment, she just sat there, and I could see the nervousness in her posture. Then she glanced over at me, and I gave her a small nod. She played a simple piece, something classical I didn't recognize. Her fingers moved carefully, hitting each note with precision. There were a couple of stumbles, moments where she hesitated, but she kept going. When she finished, the room erupted in applause. She stood and gave a little bow, her face flushed with pride. After the recital, we went out for ice cream, just the four of us. Emma chattered about the performance, about how nervous she'd been, about the girl who played before her and messed up halfway through. Lucas ate his ice cream too fast and got a brain freeze, which made Emma laugh so hard she nearly fell off her chair. My mother sat beside me, smiling quietly, her hand resting on mine. This is what it's supposed to be like, I thought. This easy, uncomplicated joy. No ultimatums, no hidden agendas. Just family. Victoria tried to reach out a few times over the following months. Not directly, but through the kids. Emma mentioned that her mom had been asking questions about where we went on Sundays, who we spent time with. Lucas said she'd asked if Grandma Elena had been buying them expensive things. I didn't engage. I just reminded the kids that what we did during our time together was our business, and they didn't have to report back to anyone. Victoria's lawyer sent a letter in November requesting a modification to the custody agreement. She wanted to reduce my time with the kids, claiming that my work schedule had become unpredictable and that the children needed more stability. It was a transparent attempt to regain control, and Richard Castellano shut it down within a week. He provided documentation of my schedule, testimony from the kids' teachers about my involvement, and a strongly worded reminder that Victoria had no grounds to request a modification unless she could prove a substantial change in circumstances that affected the children's well-being. The letter stopped after that. But the tension didn't. One night in early December, I got a call from Emma. It was late, almost 10, well past her bedtime. Her voice was small and shaky. "Dad? Hey, sweetheart. What's wrong? Why are you still up? Mom and Brett are fighting. It's really loud." My chest tightened. "Where are you right now?" "In my room. Lucas is with me. We locked the door." "Okay. Stay there. I'm coming to get you." I hung up and grabbed my keys. The drive to Victoria's house took 15 minutes, but it felt like an hour. When I pulled up, the lights were on inside, and I could hear raised voices even from the driveway. I knocked hard on the front door. Victoria answered, her face flushed, mascara smudged. "What are you doing here?" "Emma called me. Said you were fighting." "I'm taking the kids." "You can't just show up and take them. It's my custody night. Watch me." I pushed past her and headed up the stairs. Emma and Lucas were in Emma's room, sitting together on the bed. Lucas was crying, his face buried in his sister's shoulder. Emma looked up when I walked in, relief flooding her expression. "Come on, guys. We're going to my place." They didn't argue. They grabbed their backpacks and followed me downstairs. Victoria tried to block the door, but Brett, who'd been standing in the kitchen, told her to let it go. I didn't thank him. I just walked my kids out to the car, buckled them in, and drove away. That night, they slept in the guest room together, Lucas curled up next to his sister like he used to do when he was smaller. I sat in the hallway outside their door, listening to their breathing even out, and I made a decision. The next morning, I called Richard Castellano. I told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he said exactly what I needed to hear. "We're filing for full custody." The custody battle that followed was brutal. Victoria's lawyer fought hard, painting me as a manipulative ex-husband who used the children to control her. They brought up the night I'd taken the kids, claiming I'd violated the custody agreement and that my actions demonstrated instability. Richard countered with Emma's phone call, with testimony from the kids about what they'd witnessed, with a pattern of behavior from Victoria that showed she prioritized her new relationship over her children's well-being. The hearing took place in February. Judge Vaughn presided again, her expression as unreadable as ever. Both Emma and Lucas were interviewed privately by a court-appointed counselor, who then delivered her findings to the judge. I wasn't allowed to hear what they said, but I could see it in Judge Vaughn's face when she returned to the courtroom. Something had shifted. The ruling came down 2 weeks later. Primary custody was awarded to me. Victoria would have visitation every other weekend and 1 evening per week, supervised if necessary. The judge cited concerns about the environment at Victoria's home and the children's expressed preference to spend more time with their father and grandmother. Victoria didn't cry. She just sat there, stone-faced, while her lawyer whispered urgently in her ear. When the judge dismissed us, she walked out without looking back. I took the kids home that day and told them the news as gently as I could. Emma nodded slowly, like she'd already known. Lucas just hugged me and said he was glad. That night, I called my mother and told her everything. She didn't say much, just told me she was proud of me and that she'd make her special lasagna for dinner that weekend. The months that followed were an adjustment. Emma and Lucas settled into their new routine, spending most of their time at my house and visiting Victoria on scheduled weekends. The fighting stopped. The tension eased. They started sleeping better, laughing more. Emma's piano playing improved. Lucas made the all-star team in Little League. Victoria faded into the background. She showed up for her visitation, but she was distant, distracted. Brett was gone by spring, replaced by someone new whose name I didn't bother learning. It became clear that her interest in the kids was tied to her ability to control the narrative, and once that was taken away, she didn't know what to do with them. My mother's health stabilized over the summer. The medication was working, and she'd made peace with the limitations her condition imposed. She moved a little slower, tired more easily, but her spirit was unchanged. She still made Sunday sauce, still insisted on hosting family dinners, still sat on her porch in the evenings and watched the world go by. One Sunday in July, we were all gathered at her house, Emma, Lucas, me, and a few cousins who'd driven in from out of state. The kids were running around in the backyard, their laughter echoing through the trees. My mother and I were sitting on the porch, watching them play. "You did good, Danny," she said quietly. "We did good, Ma. I couldn't have done any of this without you." She reached over and patted my hand. "Your father would be proud. You stood up for what mattered, even when it cost you." I looked out at the yard, at my children playing in the same space where I'd played as a kid. I thought about everything that had happened, the ultimatum, the divorce, the custody battle. I thought about the trust, the money I'd never asked for but was grateful to have. And I thought about the choice I'd made, the one that had set all of this in motion. Some people would say I was stubborn. That I should have compromised, should have found a middle ground. But I knew the truth. There was no middle ground when it came to family. You either honored the people who made you, or you betrayed them. And I'd chosen honor. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. Emma called out that she'd found a lightning bug, and Lucas ran over to see. My mother smiled, and I realized that this, right here, was what my father had been protecting. Not the money. Not the assets. This. The ability to live with dignity, to provide for the people you love, to make choices based on what's right instead of what's easy. Victoria sent me a message that night. It was short, just a few lines. "I know you think you won. But you didn't win anything. You just proved that you'll always choose her over everyone else." I read it twice, then deleted it without responding. There was nothing to say. She still didn't understand, and maybe she never would. The choice had never been between my mother and my wife. It had been between truth and manipulation, between loyalty and control. And I'd chosen the side that let me sleep at night. The trust continued to grow, compounding quietly in the background of my life. Feinstein sent quarterly reports, updates on investments and returns. I didn't touch the principal, just let it sit and build. Emma and Lucas would inherit it one day, and when they did, they'd have the same protection my father had given me. They'd have options. They'd have security. And they'd know that their grandfather, a man they'd never met, had loved them enough to plan for their future before they were even born. That fall, Emma started middle school. She was nervous the first day, worried about getting lost in the hallways and not making friends. I drove her to school and walked her to the entrance, and she looked up at me with the same expression she'd had before her piano recital. "You'll be fine," I said. "Just be yourself." What if that's not enough? It's always enough. She nodded, took a deep breath, and walked through the doors. I watched her disappear into the crowd of students, and I felt that familiar ache of watching your child grow up and away from you. But it was a good ache, the kind that comes from knowing you've done your job right. Lucas was thriving too. He'd made a best friend on his baseball team, a kid named Tyler who was over at our house so often I started setting an extra place at dinner. They'd spend hours in the backyard, throwing a ball back and forth, talking about things only 8-year-old boys find important. My mother would sit on the porch and watch them, and sometimes I'd catch her smiling in a way that reminded me of how she used to watch me and my sister play. Victoria's visitations became less frequent. She'd cancel last minute, citing work obligations or personal emergencies. The kids stopped asking why. They just adjusted, made plans around her absence instead of waiting for her presence. It was sad in a way, but also freeing. They didn't have to perform for her anymore, didn't have to walk on eggshells or wonder if they'd done something wrong. By the time winter rolled around again, almost 2 years after the divorce, my life had settled into something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Peace. Not the absence of problems, but the presence of stability. I had my kids most of the time. I had my mother, still strong despite her age and health issues. I had work that paid the bills and friends who showed up when it mattered. And I had the knowledge that I'd made the right choice, even when it had been the hardest one. One evening in late November, I was helping my mother put up her Christmas decorations. It was a tradition we'd started after my father died, just the two of us stringing lights and hanging ornaments while old carols played on the radio. Emma and Lucas were at Victoria's for the weekend, one of the rare times she'd actually followed through on her visitation. We were untangling a strand of lights when my mother suddenly stopped and looked at me. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her tone made me pause. "Okay. What is it?" "I'm selling the house." I stared at her. "What? Why?" "Because it's time." She set down the lights and sat on the couch. "I've been thinking about it for a while. This place is too big for me now. Too many stairs, too much maintenance. And honestly, Danny, it's starting to feel like a museum instead of a home. But this is your home. This is where you and Dad built your life." It was. But life doesn't stay in one place. She looked around the room, at the familiar furniture and faded wallpaper. "I've loved this house. But I don't need it anymore. What I need is to be closer to you and the kids. I want to spend whatever time I have left being part of your lives, not sitting here alone waiting for you to visit." I didn't know what to say. The thought of her leaving this house felt like losing another piece of my father, another connection to the past. But I also understood what she was saying. She wasn't giving up. She was choosing differently. "Where will you go?" I was thinking maybe a small apartment. Something near you, close enough that I can walk to your place if I want. Nothing fancy, just enough space for me and my things. We talked about it for the rest of the evening, going over logistics and timelines. She'd already contacted a realtor, already started sorting through what to keep and what to donate. By the time I left that night, the decision was made. She'd list the house after the holidays. The house sold quickly. A young couple with a baby bought it, and my mother seemed genuinely happy for them. She said it was good to know the house would have life in it again, that another family would make memories there. We moved her into a small 2-bedroom apartment in March. It was on the ground floor of a building 3 blocks from my house, with a patio that overlooked a small garden. Emma and Lucas helped her unpack, carefully arranging her things in the new space. She set up her kitchen exactly the way she wanted it, hung her pictures on the walls, and placed my father's old armchair by the window where the light was good. By the time we finished, the apartment felt like her, warm and welcoming despite its size. That first Sunday in her new place, we made sauce together just like we always had. The kitchen was smaller, but it didn't matter. The smell was the same, the ritual unchanged. Emma stirred while Lucas set the table. My mother moved between the stove and the counter with the ease of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. And I stood there, watching it all, feeling grateful for a second chance I hadn't known I needed. Victoria stopped reaching out altogether after that. No more messages, no more attempts to change the custody arrangement. She showed up for her scheduled visitations sometimes, but more often than not, she'd cancel. The kids stopped being disappointed. They just filled the time with other things, with friends and activities and the kind of childhood that doesn't require constant management. I ran into her once, by accident, at a grocery store in the summer. She was alone, pushing a cart through the produce section. She looked different, thinner maybe, or just tired. We made eye contact for a brief second, and I nodded. She didn't return it, just turned and walked in the other direction. There was a time when seeing her would have hurt, would have brought up all the anger and betrayal. But standing there in the middle of the grocery store with a bag of oranges in my hand, I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not resentment. Just indifference. And that's how I knew I'd truly moved on. The trust remained untouched. I thought about using some of the income for a bigger house or a nicer car, but I didn't need those things. What I needed, I already had. Security for my kids. Time with my mother. A life built on choices I could be proud of. Feinstein called one afternoon in September with news. One of the investments my father had made, a small tech startup he'd bought shares in back in the 90s, had been acquired by a larger company. The payout was substantial, adding another $2 million to the trust's total value. Your father had good instincts, Feinstein said. He knew how to spot potential. I guess he did. What do you want to do with the additional funds? Leave it alone. Let it grow. Smart choice. He paused. You know, Daniel, I've been managing trusts for 40 years. I've seen families torn apart over money, seen people destroy relationships because they couldn't separate wealth from worth. Your father understood something most people don't. Money is a tool, not a purpose. He built this trust to protect you, but what really protected you was the values he instilled. The money just gave you options when you needed them. I thanked him and hung up. That night, I wrote a letter to Emma and Lucas, something they wouldn't read until they were much older. I explained the trust, where it came from, what their grandfather had intended. I told them about the choice I'd made, about standing up for family even when it cost me. And I told them that wealth wasn't about the number in a bank account. It was about having enough to live with dignity and help the people who matter. I sealed the letter and put it in my safe. One day, when they were old enough to understand, I'd give it to them. Until then, I'd just keep showing them what it looked like to live with integrity, to honor the people who came before, and to build a life that mattered. My mother's 75th birthday fell on a Sunday in October. We threw her a small party at my house, just family and a few close friends. She wore a blue dress she'd bought for the occasion and smiled more than I'd seen her smile in years. The kids had made her a card covered in drawings and glitter. My sister video called from Seattle, and we all gathered around the phone to sing happy birthday. After everyone left and the kids were in bed, my mother and I sat on the back porch. The air was cool, and the stars were out, bright and clear. We didn't talk much, just sat in comfortable silence. Thank you, she said eventually. For what? For not letting me be forgotten. I reached over and took her hand. Never, Ma. Never. We sat there until the chill drove us inside, and as I locked up the house and turned off the lights, I thought about everything that had led to this moment. The ultimatum. The divorce. The battle for my kids. The trust that had protected us all. And I realized that my father had been right. Wealth wasn't about having more. It was about having enough. Enough to protect the people you love. Enough to make choices based on what's right. Enough to live with dignity. And that, more than anything, was the legacy he'd left me. The years passed in the quiet way that good years do, without drama or crisis, just the steady accumulation of ordinary moments that somehow add up to a life. Emma graduated from high school with honors and a scholarship to study music education at a state university 2 hours away. Lucas followed 3 years later, choosing engineering, something that surprised no one who'd ever watched him take apart and reassemble every electronic device in the house just to see how it worked. My mother made it to both graduations. She was 80 by then, moving with a walker but still sharp as ever. She sat in the audience with tears streaming down her face when Emma walked across that stage, and she gripped my hand so tight during Lucas's ceremony that I thought she might break bones. Afterward, we took photos on the lawn, and she stood between her grandchildren with her arms around their waists, smiling like she'd won the lottery. Victoria showed up to Emma's graduation but left before the ceremony ended. She didn't come to Lucas's at all. The kids had stopped expecting her presence years ago. They'd learn to fill the space she left with other people, with friends and teachers and coaches who actually showed up. They called her on her birthday and Mother's Day, kept the relationship cordial but distant, the way you might treat a distant relative you see once a year at reunions. The trust had grown to nearly $18 million by the time Emma turned 21. Feinstein called me into his office that spring to discuss the transition plan my father had outlined. Emma would receive full access to her portion when she turned 25, and Lucas would get his at the same age. Until then, the funds would remain invested, continuing to compound. "Have you told them?" Feinstein asked. "Not yet. I wanted to wait until they were both out of school, established in their lives. I don't want the money to change how they see themselves or what they think they need to accomplish." "That's wise." He leaned back in his chair. "Your father would approve. He built this trust to give them security, not to rob them of ambition." I met with Emma first, on a weekend when she came home to visit. We sat in the kitchen of the house she'd grown up in, the one I'd bought after the divorce, and I told her everything. About her grandfather, about the trust, about the values he'd wanted to pass down along with the wealth. She listened without interrupting, her face serious, absorbing every word. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I'll never forget. "I always wondered why you never seemed stressed about money. Why you could afford to be there for us even when other parents were working overtime just to keep up. Now I understand. The money gave me options," I said. "But it didn't make the choices for me. I still had to decide what mattered. And you chose us." She smiled, and I saw her grandmother in that smile, the same warmth and understanding. "That's the real inheritance, Dad. Not the money. The example." I told Lucas a few months later, during a weekend fishing trip we took to the same lake my father used to bring me to. He took it differently than Emma had. He was more practical, immediately asking about investment strategies and tax implications and how to maximize returns without taking unnecessary risks. I realized he'd inherited my father's analytical mind, the same careful approach to building and protecting wealth. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about responsibility, about how money could be a tool for good or a source of destruction depending on how it was used. I told him about Victoria, about how she'd fought so hard to get her hands on something that was never hers. I told him to be careful who he trusted, to look for people who loved him for who he was, not what he had. He nodded slowly, casting his line into the water. "Did you ever regret it? Choosing Grandma over Mom?" "Never. Not for a second. Even though it cost you your marriage? Especially because of that. Because it showed me what my marriage really was." We caught 3 fish that day, threw them all back, and drove home as the sun set behind us. That night, I called my mother and told her about the conversations I'd had with the kids. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she said the same thing she always said when I did something she approved of. "Your father would be proud." My mother's health took a turn the following winter. She'd been doing well, all things considered, but one morning in January, she didn't answer her phone. I drove to her apartment and found her on the floor beside her bed, conscious but unable to get up. She'd fallen during the night and had been lying there for hours, too weak to reach her phone. The hospital admitted her immediately. Tests revealed that her heart was failing faster than the medication could manage. The doctors talked about options, about procedures that might buy her more time, but she refused them all. She was 81 years old and tired, and she'd made peace with whatever came next. They kept her for observation for a week, then transferred her to a hospice facility that felt more like a home than a hospital. The rooms had real furniture and windows that looked out on a garden. They let me bring in her favorite blanket and the photos she kept on her nightstand. Emma and Lucas came home from school, and we took turns sitting with her, reading to her, playing the old Italian songs she loved. She was lucid most of the time, slipping in and out of sleep but always aware of who was in the room. One afternoon when it was just the two of us, she reached for my hand and squeezed it weakly. "I'm ready, Danny," she said. "I've had a good life. A long life. And I got to see my grandchildren grow up. Not every mother gets that. I don't know how to let you go, Ma. You don't have to let me go. I'll always be with you. She smiled, her eyes closing. In the sauce recipe. In the way Emma plays piano. In the way Lucas fixes things. I'm in all of it. She passed away 3 days later, just before dawn on a Tuesday morning. Emma and Lucas were both there, and we held her hands as she took her last breath. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of ending she deserved. We sat with her for a while after, none of us ready to leave, and then we called the nurse and began the process of saying goodbye. The funeral was small, just family and a few neighbors who'd known her for decades. We buried her next to my father in the cemetery on the hill, under a tree that bloomed pink in the spring. Emma played piano during the service, one of the classical pieces my mother had loved. Lucas read a passage from the Bible, the same one my mother used to read to him when he was small. And I stood at the podium and talked about a woman who'd given everything she had to the people she loved and never asked for anything in return. After the service, we went back to my house and gathered in the kitchen. Someone had brought food, casseroles and salads and desserts that would sit untouched for days. We stood around talking in quiet voices, sharing memories, and I realized that this gathering of people who loved her, was the real measure of a life well lived. Victoria sent flowers but didn't attend. I didn't expect her to. We hadn't spoken in years, not since a brief encounter at Lucas's high school graduation where she'd congratulated him stiffly and left immediately after. The kids had long since stopped expecting anything from her. She'd become a ghost in their lives, present only in the vague sense that she existed somewhere, doing something, with someone. The grief hit harder than I expected. I thought I was prepared, had convinced myself that watching her decline meant I'd already started mourning. But the finality of her absence, the fact that I could never call her again or show up at her door or ask her advice, that hollowed me out in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself reaching for the phone to tell her something, then remembering she wasn't there to answer. I'd drive past her old apartment and feel the urge to stop, to check on her, before reality caught up. Emma and Lucas struggled too, each in their own way. Emma threw herself into her studies, practicing piano for hours until her fingers ached. Lucas became quieter, more withdrawn, spending long nights in his dorm room working on projects he wouldn't talk about. We checked in with each other regularly, had dinners together when they came home on weekends, but the grief sat between us like a fourth person at the table, unspoken but always present. It took months before the sharp edges of loss started to soften. I began going through my mother's things, sorting what to keep and what to donate. I found boxes of old letters my father had written to her during their courtship, full of promises and plans and the kind of earnest affection that feels almost quaint now. I found photo albums documenting decades of birthdays and holidays and ordinary Sundays. And I found a journal she'd kept during the last years of her life, filled with observations about her grandchildren and reflections on what it meant to grow old with grace. One entry, dated 6 months before she died, stopped me cold. Danny made the right choice all those years ago. I know it cost him his marriage, and I know he struggled with that decision. But I'm grateful he chose family over convenience, love over obligation. Some people spend their whole lives trying to please everyone and end up pleasing no one. My son knows who he is. And that's the greatest gift a mother can receive. I read that entry 3 times, sitting on the floor of her old apartment surrounded by boxes and memories. Then I carefully placed the journal in the keep pile, knowing I'd want to share it with Emma and Lucas one day. The trust continued to grow, quietly and steadily, managed by Feinstein with the same careful attention my father would have approved of. I'd started using some of the income to establish a scholarship fund in my mother's name, something that would help local students pursue music education. Emma had suggested it, and Lucas had helped set up the structure. The first scholarship was awarded the spring after my mother died, to a girl from Cranston who played violin and wanted to be a teacher. Emma graduated with her degree in music education and got a job teaching elementary school music in a district 30 minutes from where I lived. She moved into a small apartment with a roommate, decorated it with thrift store furniture and plants she couldn't quite keep alive, and threw herself into her work with the same dedication my mother had shown to everything she cared about. She called me most Sundays, and we'd talk about her students, about lesson plans and classroom management and the strange joy of watching children discover they could make music. Lucas finished his engineering degree and accepted a position at a firm that specialized in renewable energy. He moved to a city 2 hours away, close enough to visit but far enough to build his own life. He was dating someone, a woman named Sarah who worked as a physical therapist and had a laugh that reminded me of my mother's. He brought her to meet me over Thanksgiving, and I could tell by the way he looked at her that this was serious. On Christmas Eve, 2 years after my mother died, we gathered at my house. Emma, Lucas, Sarah, and a few close friends who'd become like family over the years. We cooked together, told stories, laughed in that slightly too loud way people do when they're trying to fill the space left by someone who's missing. After dinner, we sat around the living room, and Emma played piano while everyone sang off-key. Later, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, I sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and my father's old Bible. I'd started reading it more regularly after my mother died, not because I'd suddenly become religious, but because the margins were filled with her handwriting, notes and underlines and little observations that gave me a window into how she'd thought about the world. I flipped to the front, where she'd written all our names and birth dates in careful script. Daniel Anthony Russo. Emma Grace Russo. Lucas James Russo. And at the bottom, in smaller letters, a quote I'd never noticed before. Love is not patronizing and it is not rude. It does not seek its own. It is not provoked. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. I sat there for a long time, staring at those words, thinking about the choice I'd made all those years ago. The ultimatum Victoria had given me. The battle that followed. The years of rebuilding and relearning what it meant to be a father, a son, a man. Some people would say I was stubborn. That I should have compromised, should have found a way to make everyone happy. But as I sat in that quiet kitchen on Christmas Eve, I knew I'd made the right choice. Not because it was easy, but because it was true. The money my father left me had protected us. It had given me options when I needed them most, had allowed me to fight for my kids without worrying about legal bills or lost income. But the real inheritance wasn't the $12 million in the trust. It was the example my parents had set, the values they'd instilled, the understanding that some things are worth fighting for even when the cost is high. Emma turned 25 in the spring. We met with Feinstein to transfer her portion of the trust. She signed the papers carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and thanked me for protecting something she hadn't known existed until recently. That evening, she took me out to dinner, insisting on paying, and we talked about her plans. She wanted to buy a small house, nothing extravagant, just a place of her own. She wanted to increase her scholarship contributions, maybe establish a music program at an underserved school. She wanted to travel, see the places our grandmother had told stories about. But mostly, she said, leaning across the table, I just want to live the way Grandma and Grandpa lived. Not for the money, but for the people. That's exactly what they'd want, I said. Lucas's 25th birthday came 3 years later. By then, he was engaged to Sarah, planning a wedding for the following summer. We went through the same process with Feinstein, and Lucas approached it with the same analytical mind he brought to everything. He had spreadsheets, projections, questions about diversification and tax strategies. But when the papers were signed and we left the office, he turned to me in the parking lot and said something that nearly broke me. Thank you for not giving up on us. For choosing family when it would have been easier to just go along with what Mom wanted. I don't think I really understood what that cost you until now. It didn't cost me anything I wasn't willing to lose. Still. He smiled, and I saw my father in that smile, the same quiet strength. I hope I'm half the father you've been. You will be, I said. Because you know what matters. The wedding was beautiful. They got married in a garden in late June, surrounded by friends and family and flowers that my mother would have loved. Emma played piano during the ceremony. I walked Lucas down the aisle, my hand on his shoulder, and I thought about my father, about how proud he'd be to see his grandson starting a family of his own. Victoria didn't come. She'd been invited, more out of obligation than expectation, but she'd sent a card with a generic message and a check that Lucas had quietly donated to charity. The kids had made peace with her absence years ago. It no longer hurt. It was just a fact, like the weather or the passage of time. After the ceremony, during the reception, I found myself standing alone near the edge of the garden. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Music drifted from the tent where people were dancing. Laughter echoed across the lawn. And I felt a presence beside me, not physical but real nonetheless. My mother, my father, the people who'd shaped me and protected me and loved me without conditions. I raised my glass in a silent toast. To family. To choices that matter. To the inheritance that can't be measured in dollars but only in lives well lived. Emma appeared at my elbow, slipping her arm through mine. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," I said. "And nothing." She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we stood there together, watching the celebration, feeling the weight of all the years that had led to this moment. Later that night, after the guests had left and the venue was being cleaned up, Lucas and Sarah found me sitting at one of the empty tables. They sat down on either side of me, and for a moment, we just existed in comfortable silence. "Dad," Lucas said finally. "Sarah and I have been talking. We want to name our first kid after Grandma. Elena if it's a girl. Elias if it's a boy." I looked at him, then at Sarah, who was smiling with tears in her eyes. I felt my own throat tighten, and I nodded because I didn't trust myself to speak. "She deserves to be remembered," Emma added, pulling up a chair. "Not just by us, but by the people who come after. The ones who'll hear the stories and learn the recipes and understand where they came from." "That's exactly what she'd want," I managed to say. We sat there until the venue staff gently reminded us they needed to close up. Then we walked out into the parking lot, hugged goodnight, and went our separate ways. I drove home slowly, taking the long route past my mother's old apartment, past the house where I'd grown up, past the cemetery where she and my father rested side by side. When I got home, I poured myself a drink and sat on the back porch. The night was clear, the stars bright. I thought about the ultimatum Victoria had given me all those years ago, the impossible choice that had somehow led to this. And I realized that it hadn't been impossible at all. It had just required me to understand what I valued most. My phone buzzed. A text from Emma. "Love you, Dad. Thanks for everything." I smiled and typed back. "Love you too, sweetheart." Another text, this time from Lucas. "Best day of my life. Glad you were here to see it." "Wouldn't have missed it for anything," I replied. I sat there for a long time, listening to the crickets and the distant sound of traffic. The trust that had protected us was now in my children's hands, and they'd use it the way my father had intended. Not as a crutch, but as a foundation. Not as an end, but as a means to live with dignity and purpose. Some stories end with revenge or vindication. Mine ended with something quieter but more lasting. It ended with family intact, values preserved, and a legacy that would outlive all of us. The $12 million had given us options, but the real wealth was in the choices we made with those options. I finished my drink, locked up the house, and went to bed. Tomorrow, I'd wake up and live another day in the life my parents had made possible. I'd call my kids, maybe visit the cemetery, definitely make my mother's sauce recipe because it was Sunday and that's what we did. And I'd remember that love, real love, doesn't come with ultimatums. It comes with sacrifice and patience and the willingness to stand up for what matters even when the cost is high. That was the inheritance my father left me. Not the money, though that helped. The understanding that some battles are worth fighting, some relationships are worth preserving, and some choices define who you are long after the moment passes. I chose my mother. And in doing so, I chose myself, my children, and the kind of man I wanted to be. Victoria took the kids temporarily, but she never got the trust, never got control, never got to rewrite the story to suit her version of events. The truth outlasted her lies. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.